Tonight, as you settle into the quiet of your room and let the noise of the day drift further away, allow your mind to travel back through the centuries to a time when Europe was thriving, unaware of the silent storm that would soon sweep across its lands. This is the entire story of the Black Death, a tale not of quick disaster, but of a creeping, relentless force that reshaped the world forever. Close your eyes and imagine Europe in the early 14th century. It's a patchwork of kingdoms and bustling trade routes, with merchants traveling by horse and ship, carrying spices, fabrics, and precious metals from distant lands. The great cities, Florence, Paris, and London, hum with energy, their streets alive with chatter, markets filled with goods, and churches ringing with bells that mark the rhythm of daily life. Feudal lords oversee vast stretches of farmland where peasants toil from dawn until dusk. Castles loom over villages, symbols of power and protection, while monasteries dot the countryside, offering both spiritual guidance and primitive medical care. Life is hard but predictable, following the cycle of the seasons. Travelers journey along the Silk Road, a lifeline connecting Europe to Asia, bringing tales of foreign empires, wonders of architecture, and exotic luxuries unseen by most Europeans. Caravans stretch like serpents across deserts and mountains, crossing through bustling hubs like Constantinople, the gateway between East and West. The seas are dotted with ships, their sails full of wind, carrying goods from port to port. But beneath this appearance of growth and connectivity lies fragility. Most of the population is poor and malnourished. Sanitation is primitive. Narrow streets reek of waste, and animals live alongside humans in cramped conditions. Medicine is rooted more in superstition than science, with treatments based on balancing humors or warding off evil spirits. Though people dream of advancement, they are still bound by ignorance of the unseen dangers that travel with them. As night falls in a medieval city, torches flicker along cobblestone roads, and the sound of hooves echoes against stone walls. Families gather in wooden homes, sharing stories by candlelight. The air smells of smoke and earth, the hum of insects mixing with distant church bells. It's peaceful in its own harsh way, a balance between survival and faith that has sustained generations. Far away on the edges of this interconnected world, events are already in motion that will shatter this fragile peace. In the vast grasslands of Central Asia, where nomadic tribes ride under endless skies, a bacterium is silently thriving within rodents and their fleas. For years it has lingered, infecting local wildlife and occasionally claiming a human victim. But as trade intensifies, as caravans and armies move faster and further than ever before, the conditions are set for something unprecedented. Along these trade routes, bustling cities like Kaffa and Tana are magnets for merchants and travelers. Fleas hitch rides on black rats, hiding in sacks of grain or nestled among fabrics. With every journey westward, the invisible passengers spread further, carrying with them a microscopic threat that no one understands. In the courts of European kings and queens, life carries on as usual. Nobles host feasts in candlelit halls, troubadours sing songs of chivalry and romance, and scholars debate theology and philosophy. The notion that a single, unseen force could bring kingdoms to their knees seems impossible. And yet, warnings are whispered. Rumors drift from the east of a strange sickness. Entire villages wiped out overnight. Corpses piled in the streets. An illness that blackens the flesh and kills without mercy. These tales are dismissed as exaggerations, distant troubles that could never touch the mighty cities of Europe. But destiny is already weaving its threads. Imagine a port city in the Mediterranean, bright under the sun, its harbor filled with ships from across the known world. Sailors unload goods, shouting in different tongues, while children run barefoot along the docks. Among the barrels and crates, unseen to all, rats scurry, their fleas biting and feeding, passing along a deadly pathogen. These are the harbingers of the Black Death. As weeks turn to months, the disease creeps westward, a shadow moving silently along the arteries of trade. It reaches villages, towns, and cities in waves, each one stronger than the last. People begin to cough and swell with mysterious lumps, fevers burn through households, and healers struggle to explain what they see. Priests pray, doctors bleed patients, but nothing works. The illness doesn't follow the known rules of sickness, it is relentless and cruel. And so, by the year 1347, Europe stands on the brink of catastrophe, though most do not yet realize it. Farmers rise early to tend their crops, merchants haggle in busy markets, and children laugh as they chase one another through narrow streets. Life continues, blissfully unaware of the darkness at its doorstep. In this first part of our story, we witness a world full of connection and opportunity, yet entirely unprepared for what is coming. The same networks that brought prosperity, trade routes, bustling ports, and the movement of people and goods will become the channels through which devastation spreads. As we drift deeper into this journey, imagine walking through those medieval streets, the sound of church bells marking the hour, the smell of baking bread and burning wood in the air. Picture the markets alive with the colors of dyed fabrics, the glint of silver coins changing hands, and the laughter of minstrels performing in public squares. This is the calm before the storm, a world on the verge of transformation unlike anything seen before. What lies ahead is not just a tale of disease, but of human endurance, faith, fear, and change. It is a story written not in books at first, but in the struggles of common folk and the desperate measures of rulers trying to protect their realms. It is a story that begins quietly, invisibly, and yet will echo for centuries to come, shaping the very course of history. And so, as we continue, let us step further into the heart of this tale, where the first signs of the Black Death begin to emerge from the east, carried by winds of fate destined to sweep across continents and alter the lives of millions. Far beyond the castles and bustling markets of Europe, in the windswept plains and rugged mountains of Central Asia, life moved to a different rhythm. Nomadic tribes roamed on horseback, guiding herds of livestock across the vast steppes. Merchants and travelers stopped at caravanserais along the Silk Road, sharing stories over fires that flickered against endless starlit skies. Unseen beneath this rugged beauty, a quiet threat had been growing for centuries. Within burrows and nests, small rodents, marmots, gerbils, and black rats harbored a microscopic killer. The bacterium, Yersinia pestis, thrived in these wild reservoirs, jumping from flea to rodent, and sometimes to humans. It was ancient, as old as time itself, but for ages it had remained mostly contained, striking sporadically, feared yet limited. By the early 1300s, the world had grown more connected than ever before. Empires stretched across Asia, linking distant lands with roads and ports. The Mongol Empire had opened enormous swaths of territory to trade, enabling merchants to journey safely from China to the Middle East. Caravans laden with silk, spices, and precious stones traveled through outposts where hundreds of travelers and animals gathered. This interconnectedness, which brought prosperity and cultural exchange, also provided the perfect pathways for the plague to spread. Imagine a merchant camp on a cold night. The crackle of a fire breaks the stillness. Horses stamp their hooves in the dark, and guards keep watch on distant ridges. Beneath the wagons, rats scurry unseen, their fleas searching for new hosts. A single bite carries with it an invisible doom, and soon a feverish cough echoes through the tents. From Central Asia, the disease moved swiftly. One account suggests it emerged from around Lake Issyk-Kul, where chronicles recorded strange outbreaks of death, decimating entire communities. Another theory points to trade cities along the Silk Road, where diverse populations gathered daily. Whatever its exact origin, the plague began to spread, carried unknowingly by travelers, merchants, and their goods. By the early 1340s, the disease had reached the trading posts of the Crimean Peninsula, where the city of Kaffa became infamous in plague history. Kaffa, a bustling port controlled by Genoese merchants, was under siege by Mongol forces. As the attackers succumbed to illness, they reportedly catapulted the bodies of the dead over the city walls, a desperate act meant to break the defenders' morale. Whether this marked the first biological warfare in history, or simply another outbreak fueled by rat-infested grain, the disease infiltrated Kaffa. Ships leaving Kaffa carried not just silk and spices, but also stowaways, infected rats, and their parasitic fleas. From there, the plague followed the arteries of maritime trade. Galleys and merchant vessels crisscrossed the Mediterranean, docking in ports such as Constantinople, Messina, and Alexandria. With each arrival, the unseen contagion spread further, carried inland by traders, pilgrims, and unsuspecting townsfolk. Imagine standing on the docks of Messina in October 1347. The sun glints off the water, seagulls wheel overhead, and merchants gather to unload a recently arrived fleet of Genoese ships. As sailors stagger down gangplanks, their faces pale and marked with strange dark swellings, whispers ripple through the crowd. Some collapse on the spot, while others wander into the city's narrow streets. Within days, the sickness has taken hold, and fear spreads like wildfire. The symptoms were unlike anything most had ever seen. Victims suffered from sudden fevers, painful swellings called buboes in their groins and armpits, and dark blotches that marred their skin. Some died within days, others within hours, leaving healers bewildered and terrified. These signs earned the plague its haunting name, the Black Death. From Messina, the disease leapt to Genoa, Venice, and Marseille. It moved inland along rivers and over mountain passes, striking villages and cities with equal ferocity. In just a few months, it reached every corner of the Italian peninsula, spreading northward and westward into the heart of Europe. In Constantinople, the jewel of Byzantium, chroniclers described entire households succumbing to the plague. The city's vibrant marketplaces fell silent, and funeral processions stretched endlessly through narrow streets. Along the Nile in Alexandria, Egyptian scholars recorded the devastation, noting that death rode the wind, striking down the young and old without warning. Despite the mounting horror, many still clung to normal life. Farmers sowed fields, bakers opened their shops, and children played in courtyards, unaware that the unseen fleas hopping from one rat to another would soon change everything. As winter approached, one might think the plague would slow, chilled by icy winds and snow-covered roads. But trade never ceased entirely. Ships continued to sail, caravans pressed on, and with them traveled death. Even in the coldest months, the disease burned like an unquenchable fire. By 1348, the Black Death had become a storm no city could escape. From Sicily to the Pyrenees, from the Adriatic to the English Channel, it followed the routes carved by human ambition and curiosity. What began as whispers from the east had become a relentless wave sweeping westward. And yet, this was only the beginning. The worst was still to come. As the plague entered France and England, it would change not just the population, but the very fabric of society, altering faith, power, and the course of human history. Now, imagine yourself walking through a once bustling marketplace. Stalls stand abandoned, goods untouched, the sound of laughter and trade replaced by silence and muffled cries from shuttered houses. Priests walk the streets with incense burners, believing the fragrant smoke will cleanse the air. Doctors dressed in strange, long-beaked masks attempt crude remedies. Horses pull carts piled with bodies toward hastily dug pits outside city walls. This is the Europe that stands on the threshold of unimaginable suffering, as the Black Death tightens its grip and begins to reshape a continent. By the spring of 1348, the Black Death had reached mainland Europe with a ferocity that few could have imagined. What had begun as distant rumors of sickness from Asia was now a horrifying reality, spreading like wildfire through villages, towns, and cities. The trade routes that had once brought prosperity and connection now acted as highways for death. Ships carried more than spices and cloth. They carried the plague into the very heart of Europe. In southern France, cities like Marseille and Avignon fell silent. Chroniclers describe days where every street echoed only with the sound of church bells tolling for the dead. Funeral processions wound through narrow alleys, so frequent that they overlapped. In Avignon, where Pope Clement VI resided, the mortality was so great that consecrated ground quickly filled, and bodies had to be thrown into the Rhone River. Yet even in these dire circumstances, people clung to rituals of faith, praying for deliverance and confessing sins in hopes of divine mercy. As the plague moved northward into Paris, the city, one of Europe's greatest centers of learning and culture, was brought to its knees. The bustling Latin Quarter, home to scholars and students, grew quiet as universities closed their doors. Markets, once filled with vibrant colors and lively barter, became places of fear, where people eyed each other suspiciously, terrified that a simple touch or shared breath might mean death. Physicians debated theories endlessly. Some believed the disease was spread through miasma, poisonous air rising from rotting matter, while others blamed divine punishment for humanity's sins. From France, the Black Death crossed into England. In June 1348, the first outbreak was reported in the port town of Melcombe Regis. The disease quickly spread inland, reaching Bristol and then London. By the summer of 1349, England was engulfed in a nightmare. Entire villages were abandoned as fields went untended and livestock wandered freely. Chroniclers wrote of priests dying in such numbers that the church could not bury its dead fast enough. Imagine London at that time, a city of wooden houses crammed together along narrow, filthy lanes. The Thames flowed sluggishly, carrying waste and refuse. The air hung heavy with smoke and disease. One chronicler claimed that by the peak of the epidemic, up to 200 bodies a day were being carted out of London to mass graves. So many perished that common burial rites were abandoned. Coffins were a luxury reserved for the wealthy, while the poor were lowered into pits by the hundreds. Elsewhere in Europe, the devastation was equally severe. In Florence, one of the most prosperous cities of the Renaissance, art and culture gave way to terror. The Italian writer Giovanni Boccaccio described how even familial bonds dissolved in the face of the plague. Parents abandoned sick children, friends refused to see each other, and servants fled their masters' homes. Society itself seemed to unravel as fear overtook every other instinct. In Germany and the Low Countries, rumors and superstitions spread almost as quickly as the disease. People searched desperately for someone to blame. Terrified and confused, some communities turned on minority groups, particularly Jewish populations, accusing them of poisoning wells or bringing the sickness intentionally. Pogroms erupted, fueled by ignorance and panic, leading to the murder of thousands who had nothing to do with the spread of the disease. Even as it decimated populations, the Black Death defied understanding. Doctors in long robes and leather masks packed with herbs walked through infected areas, believing the aromatic scents would filter out the disease. Treatments ranged from bloodletting and lancing buboes to concoctions of mercury and arsenic, none of which worked. Religious processions of flagellants, groups who whipped themselves publicly to atone for humanity's sins, marched from town to town, hoping to earn God's forgiveness and end the suffering. But no prayers, rituals, or remedies slowed the relentless advance of the plague. Imagine yourself standing in a medieval town square as this catastrophe unfolds. The sun is setting, casting a warm glow on stone buildings, but the usual evening bustle is gone. The laughter of children, the bark of vendors, and the music of traveling minstrels have been replaced by whispers and weeping. A lone bell tolls from a nearby church, marking yet another death. From behind closed shutters, faint coughing can be heard. The streets are nearly empty except for a covered cart pulled by a weary horse, stopping occasionally as men lift wrapped bodies onto it. As summer turned to autumn, it seemed as though the Black Death spared no one, rich or poor, noble or peasant, priest or farmer. Some tried to flee to the countryside, but the disease followed. Others sealed themselves in their homes, only to die of starvation or illness. Whole families disappeared within days. Chroniclers recorded entire hamlets, wiped off the map, their existence remembered only in passing mentions, in ledgers and church records. By the end of 1349, the scale of loss was unimaginable. Estimates suggest that in some areas, half the population had died. The social order teetered on the brink of collapse. Fields lay fallow, harvests rotted in barns, and trade halted. Yet despite the overwhelming despair, life in its most basic form clung on. Survivors buried the dead, cared for the sick, and tried to hold together the fragments of their communities. As the plague rolled through Europe, it left not just death in its wake, but transformation. Labor shortages began to shift the balance of power between peasants and landowners. Religious faith was shaken to its core, while art and literature took on darker, more introspective themes. The Black Death was not merely a catastrophe, it was a turning point that would alter the very foundations of European society. And still, the plague showed no signs of stopping. The disease moved further north into Scandinavia and eastward into Russia, across every kingdom and principality, from the smallest village to the greatest city. People wondered if the world was ending, if humanity itself was doomed to vanish like so many households already had. Now, as we continue, imagine walking through these haunted landscapes. Towns stand half empty, their streets lined with abandoned homes. Churches are silent, their clergy dead or dying. The horizon is marked by pyres of burning clothes and belongings, desperate attempts to cleanse the unseen corruption. Europe has become a continent in mourning, a shadow of its former self, as the Black Death continues its terrible march. In the midst of Europe's devastation, people turned to whatever means they could find to make sense of the chaos surrounding them. Faith, long a cornerstone of medieval life, became both a source of comfort and of deep turmoil. As cities emptied and mass graves filled, prayers echoed louder than ever before rising from cathedrals and roadside shrines alike. But alongside these prayers came doubt, anger, and a desperate search for meaning in what seemed like divine punishment without end. Imagine the grand cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris during the plague years, once a symbol of heavenly glory and human achievement. Its soaring arches and stained glass windows now tower over rows of desperate worshippers. Candles flicker weakly in the smoky air as priests chant litanies, their voices trembling. The faithful kneel shoulder to shoulder, clutching rosaries, hoping that God's mercy might finally stem the tide of death. Outside, funeral processions wind past the church steps, one after another, as the dead are carried to consecrated ground that is already overflowing. Many believed the plague was divine retribution, a punishment for humanity's sins. Preachers thundered from pulpits, urging repentance and moral purification. Pilgrimages to holy sites increased, with men and women traveling hundreds of miles on foot, hoping that acts of devotion might spare their lives or cleanse their souls. But as more priests and monks succumbed to the disease, confidence in the Church's ability to intercede with God began to erode. If the holiest of men could not escape death, what hope did ordinary people have? In towns across Europe, a movement known as the Flagellants emerged. These were groups of devout believers who roamed from city to city, stripping to the waist and whipping themselves with leather thongs tipped with metal. Their processions were solemn and grim, marked by hymns and prayers, as they sought to atone for the sins of the world. Entire communities would gather to watch these public acts of penance, some joining the ranks of the Flagellants in desperate hope that self-inflicted suffering might appease God's wrath. Elsewhere, superstition took hold. Astrologers claimed the alignment of planets had corrupted the air, turning it poisonous. Physicians prescribed carrying fragrant herbs or burning aromatic woods to counteract the supposed miasma. Nobles commissioned elaborate talismans, and peasants hung charms over their doors. It was said that ringing church bells or firing cannons could drive away the evil spirits spreading the disease. The medical profession, limited by the knowledge of the time, struggled in vain. Imagine a medieval doctor visiting a plague-stricken household, dressed in a long waxed robe, gloves, and a wide-brimmed hat, his face obscured by a grotesque beaked mask stuffed with vinegar-soaked cloth and herbs. The physician carries a wooden cane used to prod and examine patients without direct contact. Inside, the air is thick with sickness. A family lies huddled on straw mats, their bodies covered in painful swellings, fever burning their skin. The doctor attempts bloodletting or prescribes concoctions of ground emeralds and theriac, a blend of spices and honey believed to cure poisons. None of it works. Within days, the house is silent, its occupants claimed by the disease. Medicine was not only ineffective, but often dangerous. Treatments like lancing buboes and purging weakened patients further. In some cities, doctors fled entirely, leaving the sick to fend for themselves. Wealth offered no protection. Kings and nobles died alongside beggars and peasants. Chronicles tell of royal courts shattered by the plague, their heirs dead, and dynasties thrown into chaos. In the countryside, survival often depended on isolation. Villagers barricaded roads, refusing entry to strangers. Some communities posted armed guards to keep outsiders away, while others fled deep into forests or mountains, abandoning their homes. Stories emerged of remote hamlets, spared entirely because no one dared enter or leave during the plague years. Yet, isolation could not shield everyone. Rats and fleas traveled invisibly, crossing barriers with ease. Social bonds, already strained by fear, continued to break apart. In many cities, neighbors turned on one another, convinced that certain groups had brought the sickness. As mentioned before, Jewish communities were especially targeted. Pogroms swept through parts of Germany, France, and Switzerland. In Strasbourg, thousands of Jews were burned alive or driven from the city, despite papal decrees condemning such violence. The desperate need to find someone to blame fueled acts of cruelty that scarred Europe for generations. Imagine walking through a once vibrant Jewish quarter, doors hanging open, shops abandoned, and streets littered with belongings left behind during panicked escapes. What was once a center of learning and trade now stands silent, another casualty not of disease, but of human hatred unleashed by terror. And yet, amid all this despair, sparks of humanity flickered. Religious orders like the Franciscans and Sisters of Mercy risked their lives to care for the sick and dying. In many towns, volunteers stepped forward to dig graves, feed orphaned children, and tend to those left behind. Chroniclers speak of humble acts of kindness, neighbors sharing bread with quarantined families, monks opening monastery gates to shelter the afflicted, strangers comforting the dying when no one else dared approach. Faith itself transformed during these dark years. Many abandoned rigid doctrines and rituals, turning instead to more personal, mystical forms of devotion. Visionaries and prophets emerged, offering new interpretations of divine will. The seeds of religious reform were planted in this era of suffering, setting the stage for movements that would later challenge the established church. The Black Death was not just a physical catastrophe, it was a profound spiritual reckoning. For every believer who clung more tightly to God, another questioned his presence altogether. For every community united in prayer, another tore itself apart with blame and vengeance. Europe's soul was being tested, reshaped by forces it could not comprehend. As we move deeper into this story, picture the flickering candlelight of a chapel where the last remaining priest prays alone, surrounded by silence. Picture the ragged procession of flagellants crossing a rain-soaked field, their chants carried by the wind. Picture the desperate mother clutching her feverish child, whispering prayers while outside the church bell tolls endlessly. This was a time of unimaginable fear, but also of resilience. Even as the Black Death seemed unstoppable, humanity searched for ways to endure, to understand, and somehow to find meaning amidst the ruin. And so, as we continue, the story will take us further into the heart of the plague years, where society itself begins to bend and break under the weight of loss, and where whispers of a changed future slowly start to emerge from the ashes of despair. Even as the Black Death ravaged Europe, life, in some fragile form, continued. In cities, towns, and villages, survivors tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy despite the ever-present shadow of death. The rhythms of medieval life, working the fields, baking bread, ringing the church bell, did not vanish entirely, but each sound, each act carried a heavy weight, as though performed on the edge of a precipice. Imagine a small medieval village in the English countryside during the height of the plague. The morning mist clings to thatched roofs, and the smell of wood smoke drifts from chimneys. Normally, the day would begin with roosters crowing and farmers leading oxen into fields. But now, silence dominates. Doors remain barred, windows shuttered. A single figure ventures to a well, drawing water with trembling hands, glancing over their shoulder at every sound. Fear lingers like a constant fog. Markets, once lively centers of trade, became eerie scenes of isolation. Merchants stayed home, and stalls stood empty. Coins lay unused in purses, because few dare to handle goods touched by others. In some places, local authorities introduced makeshift quarantines, ordering that bread, wine, and other supplies be left outside homes to avoid contact. Wooden sticks with hooks were used to pass food and collect payment, allowing people to keep a cautious distance. In cities like Florence and London, desperation bred invention. New laws attempted to control movement, requiring households to mark their doors if plague had struck inside. Painted crosses or crude symbols warned others to stay away. Infected families were sometimes sealed in their homes, watched by guards to ensure no one escaped. For those inside, survival depended on the kindness of neighbors willing to deliver food and water from afar. Yet, even under such conditions, people found ways to cling to life's routines. Bakers continued to knead dough. Though fewer loaves emerged from their ovens, blacksmiths hammered metal with weary arms, the ringing of their hammers echoing through nearly empty streets. Farmers still guided plows across fields, though they might collapse before the workday ended. Bells still rang for church services, though pews sat half empty, and hymns sounded more like laments than praises. In wealthier households, lords and ladies retreated to remote estates, hoping to escape the miasma of the cities. Servants erected makeshift barriers around manors, restricting visitors and burning foul-smelling herbs to cleanse the air. Nobles dined separately from one another, and letters were passed through open windows or tied to sticks to avoid direct contact. Entire courts fled into the countryside, leaving behind deserted castles and abandoned government halls. For peasants and the poor, isolation was rarely possible. They lived shoulder to shoulder in cramped dwellings, where a single infection meant doom for the entire household. Entire families perished within days, their homes standing like silent tombs. In urban tenements, neighbors listened helplessly as coughs and cries came from behind walls, too thin to offer protection. The close quarters of city life allowed fleas to move easily from person to person, ensuring the disease spread relentlessly. Imagine walking through a medieval street at midday. The sun struggles to pierce a sky filled with smoke from burned refuse. Dogs and cats, left ownerless, scavenge for scraps. The once familiar calls of fishmongers and fruit sellers are gone, replaced by the occasional rumble of a death cart pulled by tired horses. Along the roadside, hastily scribbled notices warn travelers not to enter, while in alleyways, makeshift shrines bloom with candles and offerings for the dead. Despite the overwhelming despair, glimmers of human connection endured. A neighbor might secretly deliver bread to a quarantined family under the cover of night. Monks opened monastery gates to shelter orphans, even as their own brothers fell ill. In some villages, communities rallied to build new wells or gather firewood for those too weak to do so. Acts of compassion became quiet rebellions against the darkness, small gestures proving that the human spirit had not been extinguished. As food supplies dwindled, ingenuity became vital. With fewer workers to till the fields, harvests rotted or were stolen by wild animals. Some desperate peasants slaughtered livestock prematurely to survive, while others foraged for nuts, roots, and edible herbs. Grain prices soared, making bread a luxury. In response, local councils sometimes imposed strict price controls or distributed food from communal stores. These measures were not always fair or effective, but they reflected attempts to hold communities together. Children who survived grew up quickly, forced to work in fields, care for siblings, or bury parents. Childhood games faded as survival became the only focus. Yet even in these conditions, laughter sometimes returned, if only briefly, a group of children chasing a stray dog through abandoned streets or playing quietly with carved wooden toys left by those who had passed. Religion remained a central pillar of daily life, though it, too, adapted. Churches held shorter services or moved them outdoors to reduce the risk of contagion. Priests carried small altars door to door, offering prayers to families who dared not enter sacred buildings. Bells still tolled for the dead, but their peals blended into a near constant background hum in many cities, each toll marking another soul lost to the plague. Amid this upheaval, even art and music evolved. Troubadours and storytellers began crafting songs about the great pestilence, tales of sorrow and resilience that spread orally between towns. Simple woodcuts and drawings depicted skeletal figures dancing with the living, a haunting image that would later inspire the motif known as the danse macabre. These early attempts to understand and process the catastrophe through creativity hinted at the cultural transformation that would follow the plague's end. Daily survival also bred superstition and magical thinking. Some carried amulets or wore charms engraved with protective symbols. Folk healers sold potions made from strange mixtures of roots, animal parts, and minerals. While useless against the disease, these rituals offered psychological comfort, giving people the sense that they were fighting back, however feebly, against an invisible enemy. As we drift further into this story, imagine yourself as one of those survivors, waking before dawn to an empty, silent village, scavenging for food in fields left untended, whispering prayers into the night while listening to distant coughing and the echo of church bells. The weight of uncertainty presses down constantly. No one knows who will live, who will die, or when the nightmare will end. Yet somehow, each day, people still wake, still walk, still try to hold their lives together, proving that even in the darkest times, the struggle to live does not fade. As the Black Death continued its relentless march across Europe, the death toll reached numbers no one had dared imagine. In many regions, entire towns and villages were left abandoned, the fields surrounding them choked with weeds and left to rot. But while the disease claimed millions of lives, it also tore apart the very fabric of medieval society. The world that began the plague years was not the same world that would emerge after it. Imagine a thriving estate in France before the plague. Hundreds of peasants laboring in fields, tending livestock, harvesting grain for their lord, who collected rents and tithes while living comfortably in his fortified manor. The balance of power between the ruling nobility and the peasantry had been stable for centuries, supported by an endless supply of labor, but as death swept across the countryside, that supply vanished. Entire communities of workers disappeared, leaving the lords without the labor needed to till fields or maintain manorial lands. Crops went unharvested, mills sat idle, and granaries emptied. Those who survived suddenly found themselves in a world where their work was desperately needed, and they knew it. For the first time in living memory, peasants could demand higher wages and better conditions. If a lord refused, a surviving laborer could simply leave and find another master willing to pay more. In England, this shift triggered significant tension. The ruling elite, fearing the collapse of their wealth and status, passed laws like the Statute of Laborers in 1351. This decree attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and made it illegal for workers to demand more money. But enforcement proved nearly impossible. There were simply too few workers to meet the demands of agriculture and trade, and surviving peasants had newfound leverage. Imagine a surviving plowman in a small English village. Before the plague, his work earned barely enough to keep his family alive. Now, with half the village gone, he holds power over the very lords, who once treated him as disposable. When offered a pittance for his labor, he refuses, walking away to the next manor over, where desperate landowners promise food, shelter, and coin. The social order, thought to be divinely ordained and unshakable, begins to crumble under the weight of survival itself. In the towns and cities, the impact was equally transformative. Guilds that once controlled trades and crafts lost members in staggering numbers. In Florence, the textile industry, a cornerstone of its wealth, collapsed temporarily due to the lack of skilled workers. In Paris and London, marketplaces shrank as merchants and artisans perished. But those who survived inherited opportunities unimaginable before the plague. Shops, properties, and businesses changed hands rapidly, often falling to widows or distant relatives who suddenly found themselves wealthy. The scarcity of labor also spurred innovation. With fewer hands to work the fields, landowners experimented with more efficient farming methods. Some abandoned traditional grain production in favor of sheep herding, which required fewer workers but yielded high profits from wool. This shift would permanently change the rural economy, laying the groundwork for future agricultural revolutions. In the realm of the church, the Black Death had stripped away countless clergy. Monasteries that once housed dozens of monks were reduced to handfuls of survivors. Parish priests died faster than they could be replaced, leaving communities without spiritual guidance. In some regions, untrained individuals were hastily ordained to fill the void, diminishing the church's prestige. The sight of high-ranking bishops and abbots succumbing to the disease shattered the notion that holy men were protected by divine favor. This erosion of religious authority had far-reaching consequences. Many began to question the church's teachings and its wealth, wondering why gold-laden cathedrals stood untouched while the poor died in the streets. Seeds of doubt planted during these plague years would centuries later bloom into sweeping reforms that forever changed Christianity in Europe. The nobility, too, saw its power challenged. With fewer peasants to tax and fewer soldiers to command, their grip on land and influence weakened. In some kingdoms, entire noble lines were extinguished by the plague, their castles left to crumble or claimed by distant heirs. In places like Italy's city-states, wealthy merchants and bankers who had survived and consolidated resources began to rival traditional aristocracy, setting the stage for the Renaissance and new forms of political power. Imagine a once mighty castle overlooking a desolate valley. Its lord has perished, his knights gone, the feudal system that upheld his reign fractured beyond repair. Below, survivors cultivate small plots of land independently, keeping what they harvest instead of surrendering it to a manor that no longer exists. The feudal chains that bound them for generations have loosened, not through rebellion, but through sheer necessity brought by the plague. Urban centers, though devastated, became crucibles for change. With population density drastically reduced, surviving citizens found space to expand homes, improve sanitation, and rebuild neighborhoods. Some cities began to enforce early forms of public health measures, quarantines for incoming ships, isolation for the sick, and rudimentary inspections of markets and goods. Though primitive, these measures marked the beginning of organized approaches to combating disease. Trade networks, once thought destroyed, gradually reemerged in altered form. Merchants who survived took advantage of reduced competition, expanding their influence and wealth. Maritime powers like Venice and Genoa rebuilt fleets and reopened trade routes, this time with heightened awareness of contagion and the need for health protocols at ports. Economically, the Black Death compressed centuries of change into a single generation. Wealth shifted dramatically as inheritance multiplied. Land and fortunes passed rapidly from victim to survivor, concentrating property into fewer hands. Some peasants rose into the ranks of the gentry. Some merchants became nobles in all but name. The rigid class structures that had defined Europe for ages cracked under the strain of death and opportunity, intertwined. As we reflect on this turbulent transformation, imagine a solitary figure standing at the edge of a fallow field. The earth is rich but untended, the manor behind them abandoned. Once a lowly serf, this survivor now owns land, a few sheep, and a modest home. The world feels uncertain, even perilous, but filled with possibilities denied to generations before. The Black Death has stolen much, but in its wake, it has also sown the seeds of a society that will never again look quite the same as it did before the great pestilence arrived. And yet the story of the Black Death does not end with social upheaval alone. As Europe struggled to rebuild its economy and hierarchy, culture, knowledge, and the very perception of life and death began to shift. The next chapter of this tale takes us into the minds and hearts of those who lived through these dark years, exploring how art, philosophy, and collective memory were forever reshaped by the shadow of the plague. The Black Death did not merely alter population numbers and power structures, it etched itself into the soul of Europe, transforming art, literature, philosophy, and the very way people viewed life and death. What had once been a society grounded in a stable medieval worldview emerged from the plague scarred, introspective, and deeply changed. Before the arrival of the plague, European art and thought revolved largely around divine order and eternal salvation. Cathedrals soared toward heaven, illuminated manuscripts depicted serene saints, and philosophy intertwined seamlessly with theology. Life was seen as a passage toward paradise, suffering as a test of faith. But the pestilence's devastation shattered this steady vision. Death was no longer a distant certainty, it was immediate, indiscriminate, and inescapable. Imagine entering a once grand church in the aftermath of the plague's first waves. The frescoes remain on the walls, but time and neglect have dimmed their brilliance. In some places, new paintings emerge, not of peaceful ascensions or triumphant saints, but of skeletal figures dancing with peasants, nobles, and clergy alike. This macabre motif, later known as the danse macabre or dance of death, symbolized the universality of mortality. Rich or poor, young or old, death claimed all without distinction. Tombstones and memorials began to bear grimmer imagery. Effigies no longer depicted only the dignified repose of knights and ladies. Some showed the deceased as decaying corpses, their flesh rotting away, a stark reminder to the living of life's fragility. These were not simply morbid decorations, they were philosophical statements carved in stone, reflecting a society grappling with trauma and searching for meaning in the face of catastrophe. In literature, the transformation was equally profound. Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron, written in the shadow of the Black Death, told stories of young Florentines fleeing the city to escape the pestilence. While humorous and romantic in parts, its very premise acknowledged a world where survival meant abandoning the structures of family, duty, and church that once defined medieval life. Later writers across Europe echoed these themes, depicting lives interrupted, hierarchies upended, and fate as unpredictable as a sudden fever. Philosophical thought turned more inward and at times more secular. Though faith remained central, questions arose about divine justice and the meaning of suffering. If God was merciful, why did entire communities vanish despite fervent prayer? Scholars began to explore ideas that hinted at human agency and natural causes rather than attributing all misfortune to divine will. This intellectual restlessness would eventually nourish the seeds of Renaissance humanism, a movement that emphasized the dignity and worth of individuals in shaping their destinies. Music, too, bore the marks of sorrow and change. Somber chants echoed through nearly empty churches. Funeral dirges replaced the jubilant hymns of past feast days. Composers began experimenting with darker tones, using dissonance to mirror collective grief. Over time, these innovations evolved into new forms of sacred and secular music that sought to express the depth of human emotion laid bare by the plague years. Picture a small workshop in Siena, Italy, where an artist labors over a wooden panel. Before the plague, he painted scenes of the Madonna and Christ in celestial glory, serene and untouched by earthly troubles. Now, his brush creates stark contrasts. Angels weep openly, saints are rendered frail and mortal, landscapes are barren, with blackened skies looming over skeletal trees. These images, born of trauma, did not simply frighten viewers. They forced contemplation of mortality and the transient nature of worldly power and beauty. This cultural shift extended to public spaces as well. Cities commissioned new forms of art and architecture that reflected both devastation and resilience. Charitable hospitals were built, not merely as medical centers, but as symbols of compassion and communal duty. Frescoes adorned their halls, depicting acts of mercy, feeding the hungry, caring for the sick, burying the dead, reminders of virtues that had sustained society in its darkest hours. The plague also reshaped festivities and public rituals. While some celebrations vanished entirely during the height of infection, others transformed into solemn commemorations. Annual processions carried relics of saints believed to have interceded against the disease, blending traditional piety with new expressions of collective memory. In time, these rituals evolved into elaborate pageants that preserved the history of suffering while affirming survival and rebirth. Even science, constrained as it was by superstition and limited knowledge, took hesitant steps forward under the plague's shadow. As physicians and scholars grappled with an illness they could not cure, they began documenting symptoms, compiling observations, and challenging older medical texts. Though understanding remained rudimentary, this era marked the beginning of more empirical approaches to disease, paving the way for future discoveries in anatomy, hygiene, and public health. Imagine sitting in a quiet cloister garden during these transformative years. Once filled with orderly rows of herbs and chanting monks, it is now partially overgrown, a silent witness to loss. Yet new shoots push through the soil, tended by younger, fewer hands. A surviving monk sketches in a worn notebook, noting patterns of sickness and recovery. He does not know it, but his records will one day guide future healers long after the plague has passed. This cultural awakening, born from darkness, was not immediate nor uniform. Many regions clung to old ways for decades, but slowly a pattern emerged. Art, thought, and memory fused into a deeper, more complex understanding of life. The world would not simply return to its pre-plague state. It had learned too much, suffered too deeply. As the years stretched on and the immediate fury of the Black Death subsided, Europe's cultural horizon began to expand. New philosophies, artistic expressions, and social ideals would eventually flourish in the Renaissance, carrying echoes of the lessons learned during the plague. The Black Death had devastated, but it had also forced humanity to confront mortality, meaning, and resilience in ways that reshaped civilization itself. And so, as we continue, let us step into the long twilight that followed the first great waves of the plague. a period of halting recovery, ongoing outbreaks, and slow, uneven rebirth, where Europe struggled to rebuild while forever changed by what it had endured. The Black Death was not a single storm that passed over Europe and disappeared. It was the beginning of an age of recurrent pestilence. Even as the first and deadliest wave subsided by the early 1350s, Europe did not awaken to peace and stability. Instead, like tremors following an earthquake, smaller yet deadly outbreaks returned again and again, shaping daily life and testing humanity's resolve for generations. Imagine a city square in Paris, a decade after the initial devastation. Buildings still bear the marks of neglect. Overgrown gardens hint at homes abandoned years before. The sound of commerce has returned, though quieter and more cautious. Market stalls reopen, guilds regroup, and craftsmen ply their trades again. Children laugh and run through the streets, where once only silence and sorrow reigned. Yet beneath this fragile normalcy lies a deep, persistent fear, an understanding that the plague could return at any moment, and it did. Historians record multiple significant resurgences. Outbreaks struck Europe in 1361, 1369, and numerous times thereafter, each taking tens of thousands of lives. Though less catastrophic than the first wave, these recurrences were devastating to populations already weakened by famine, war, and social upheaval. A child born after the first outbreak might grow up to witness 2 or 3 more epidemics before adulthood, each reshaping communities and reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. The generation that survived the initial Black Death developed new customs to cope with the uncertainty. Quarantine, a concept born in the city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, became more common. Ships arriving in ports were required to remain offshore for 40 days, quaranta giorni before docking. This practice, though crude, slowed the spread of future outbreaks and marked an early triumph of organized public health. In Venice, the Republic established one of the world's first official plague hospitals, or lazarettos, located on isolated islands. These institutions housed the sick, separating them from the healthy. Guards patrolled harbor entrances, inspecting cargo and crew for signs of illness. While these measures were often harsh and poorly understood, they demonstrated a shift toward collective strategies to manage disease, foreshadowing modern epidemiology. Life in plague-prone areas took on a rhythm of vigilance. Families stored herbs, protective charms, and medicines in preparation for new waves. Town councils drafted emergency rules that could be enacted quickly: curfews, bans on gatherings, restrictions on movement. Churches kept records of burials and baptisms meticulously, their ledgers showing the grim cycles of death and rebirth that defined the late medieval period. Imagine a rural village in Germany in 1361. The land has partially recovered, fields once fallow, now bearing wheat again. Farmers sing while harvesting, their voices rising over the drone of bees. Yet, as autumn sets in, reports arrive from nearby towns of strange swellings and sudden fevers. The songs falter, bells begin to toll once more, doors are barred, markets close, and families retreat into isolation. By winter, half the village has vanished, and the survivors begin again, the painful task of burying the dead and rebuilding from ruin. Recurring outbreaks also left marks on the arts and collective psyche. Writers and chroniclers described a world where joy was fleeting and life precarious. The dance macabre became an enduring symbol, painted on church walls and carved into wooden panels across Europe, reminding all who saw it that death spared no rank or age. Folklore flourished with tales of wandering spirits and omens foretelling new plagues, blending fear with imagination in ways that still haunt literature and legends today. The economy, already shaken, struggled to stabilize amid repeated shocks. Labor shortages continued, and inflation soared as surviving workers demanded higher wages. Attempts by authorities to restore pre plague conditions repeatedly failed, fueling unrest and occasional uprisings. In France, England, and other kingdoms, peasant revolts erupted, partly rooted in the social and economic transformations born of the plague era. And yet, resilience persisted. Communities learned to rebuild more efficiently. Trade slowly revived, with merchants adapting to new health measures and shorter routes. Agricultural practices shifted permanently toward less labor intensive methods, improving productivity over time. Towns ravaged by disease rebuilt with wider streets and better ventilation, early steps toward modern urban planning. The church too adjusted. Religious orders founded new hospitals and charities, while theologians grappled with questions of suffering and divine justice. Though faith had been shaken, it did not vanish. Instead, it evolved, inspiring new forms of devotion and ultimately contributing to reform movements in later centuries. In every corner of Europe, these cycles of death and recovery became part of life's rhythm. Children played in rebuilt streets where their grandparents had dug mass graves. Monks copied manuscripts in monasteries erected on the ashes of plague-stricken abbeys. Farmers worked fields that had lain untended for decades. Life resumed, not in defiance of death, but in quiet acknowledgement that death was now a constant companion. Picture the harbor of Venice in the late 14th century. Sunlight glints off the lagoon, sails billow in the breeze, and bustling merchants unload exotic goods from distant lands. Yet on a nearby island, the lazaretto looms, stone walls enclosing patients, doctors in beaked masks patrolling its courtyards. The city thrives again, but its prosperity is guarded by these silent sentinels, built from hard lessons learned during decades of pestilence. By the dawn of the 15th century, Europe had not vanquished the plague. It would continue to strike in waves for centuries, but humanity had adapted. Public health measures, changes in economy and labor, and shifts in culture and thought had reshaped the continent into something unrecognizable from the world of 1347. The Black Death had carved deep scars, yet from those scars, a different, more resilient society emerged. And still, as we journey further into this story, we must look beyond survival and adaptation to understand the plague's ultimate legacy, how it transformed not just individual lives or nations, but the trajectory of human history itself. From the ashes of the Black Death rose ideas, movements, and innovations that would lay the foundations for a new age, the dawn of the Renaissance, and the birth of modern Europe. From the deepest shadows of the Black Death emerged a world profoundly transformed, a world that had witnessed unimaginable suffering, yet one that began to stir with the first signs of rebirth. The Renaissance, an era of renewed curiosity, artistic brilliance, and intellectual awakening, did not spring from peace and stability alone. It was forged in the crucible of devastation, shaped by the lessons, losses, and resilience of those who survived the great pestilence. Imagine Florence in the late 14th century. Once silenced by death, the city's streets now hum again with life. Merchants barter in markets rebuilt from ruins, artisans work in sunlit workshops, and scholars gather in the shade of monasteries that had once served as plague hospitals. The city bears scars, abandoned buildings, empty spaces where families vanished, but among these scars bloom fresh ideas. The suffering endured has shifted how people see the world, how they view themselves, and how they dare to dream of what might come next. One of the most profound changes lay in the relationship between humans and the divine. The Black Death had shaken blind faith in unquestioned authority, revealing that even the holiest were not spared by catastrophe. People began turning inward, exploring personal faith and direct encounters with spirituality, rather than relying solely on church hierarchy. This quiet transformation planted seeds of reform that would later blossom in religious movements across Europe. In art, a new realism emerged. Before the plague, religious paintings often depicted idealized, otherworldly figures. Afterward, artists sought to capture life as it truly was, its beauty and its frailty. Faces became more human, emotions more raw, and scenes more grounded in earthly existence. The experience of mass mortality had made people acutely aware of time's fleeting nature, inspiring works that celebrated both life's temporality and its preciousness. Picture a young artist in Florence, sketching in a dusty workshop. The drawings show not just saints and angels, but farmers, merchants, grieving mothers, and laughing children. These figures bear the weight of survival, their expressions filled with longing, resilience, and quiet triumph. This new approach to art would pave the way for masters like Giotto, Masaccio, and later Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, whose works fused spirituality with humanity in ways previously unimagined. The intellectual realm was equally transformed. Scholars began revisiting classical texts from ancient Greece and Rome, preserved through the centuries in monasteries and Arabic translations. In the face of the Black Death's destruction, these writings offered a vision of knowledge, not bound entirely by theology, but grounded in reason, inquiry, and the potential of the human mind. The rediscovery of ancient philosophy and science sparked a wave of humanism, a belief in the value, dignity, and capabilities of individuals. Imagine a quiet library in a Florentine convent. Dusty scrolls and manuscripts line wooden shelves, their ink faded with age. A surviving monk, who had once copied medical records during the plague, now pores over ancient writings by Aristotle and Hippocrates. He begins to compare these texts with his own observations of illness and recovery, questioning old doctrines, inching toward a more rational understanding of the natural world. This pursuit of knowledge, born of tragedy, would later fuel advancements in medicine, anatomy, and public health. Economically, the redistribution of wealth caused by the Black Death played a crucial role in this rebirth. With vast estates left without heirs, property and fortunes passed to surviving relatives or were sold to merchants and tradesmen. This influx of resources enabled the rise of a wealthy middle class, particularly in Italian city-states like Florence, Venice, and Milan. These new patrons invested in art, education, and architecture, commissioning works that defined Renaissance culture. Picture the grand hall of a Florentine banker's home. Frescoes cover the walls, depicting not just biblical scenes, but landscapes of the Tuscan countryside, bustling marketplaces, and portraits of living family members, a celebration of earthly life that would have seemed bold, even heretical, a century earlier. These patrons supported artists, funded libraries, and sponsored scholars, laying the financial and cultural foundation for one of the most vibrant periods in human history. Science and medicine, though still bound by superstition, began to evolve as well. The sheer failure of medieval medical practices against the plague spurred curiosity and experimentation. Physicians dissected cadavers in secret to understand anatomy, challenging centuries of taboo. Alchemists tinkered with early chemistry, seeking cures and stumbling upon new discoveries. Over time, this thirst for understanding would lead to breakthroughs in epidemiology, surgery, and hygiene that would save countless lives in centuries to come. Education expanded beyond the cloisters of monasteries. Universities began to shift their curricula, incorporating classical studies alongside theology. Literacy rates slowly climbed as families recognized the power of knowledge in navigating an uncertain world. The horrors of the plague had taught survivors that understanding, not superstition alone, could offer protection against future calamities. Even architecture reflected this rebirth. The stark, fortified structures built during plague years to isolate the sick gave way to airy, light-filled spaces designed to celebrate life and community. Domes, arches, and grand piazzas emerged across Europe, inviting people to gather, learn, and create together. These designs symbolized more than wealth. They were declarations of resilience, proof that from darkness, beauty, and progress could rise. Imagine walking through Florence decades after the first plague wave. The air is filled with the sound of chisels shaping marble, the scent of wet plaster from frescoes being painted high on scaffolds. Children chase each other across the wide squares, laughing, while scholars debate under colonnades. Bells ring from rebuilt churches, not only to mourn the dead, but to celebrate weddings, feasts, and the rhythm of life returning. The city that had once wept beneath a shadow of despair now hums with energy, creativity, and a belief that humanity could rebuild something greater than what had been lost. And yet, even as this dawn broke, the memory of the Black Death never vanished. The trauma lingered in the collective consciousness, shaping values, ethics, and ambitions for generations. This tension between remembrance of death and celebration of life defined the Renaissance spirit. The same hands that carved joyful Madonnas and built sunlit chapels had once dug mass graves and rung funeral bells. As we continue this story, we step into the final acts of transformation, where Europe not only recovers, but begins to chart new paths in politics, exploration, and thought, setting the stage for a world forever changed by the Black Death. As Europe crawled out from the shadow of the Black Death, power itself began to shift. The traditional medieval order, rooted in rigid feudal hierarchies, divine monarchies, and absolute church authority, had been fractured beyond repair. In its place, new political structures and ambitions emerged, ultimately setting the stage for a period of global exploration and the rise of modern nation-states. Imagine a royal court in France shortly after the first plague wave. The throne room is quieter now, its once bustling entourage of courtiers reduced by death. Advisors debate feverishly, struggling to maintain control over a kingdom whose countryside is dotted with abandoned villages and empty castles. Royal decrees to enforce feudal dues go ignored as peasants, emboldened by labor shortages, demand rights and freedoms unthinkable in earlier decades. The old balance of power between crown, nobility, and commoners is shifting rapidly. This disruption was not confined to France. Across Europe, similar changes unfolded. Feudal lords, weakened by the loss of manpower and wealth, found themselves unable to enforce centuries-old obligations. Surviving peasants negotiated better contracts or abandoned their manorial ties entirely to seek wages in towns. Some lords turned to leasing land for fixed rents rather than demanding traditional services, gradually transforming Europe from a feudal economy into one driven by market forces. In England, this tension culminated in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Picture thousands of commoners marching on London, demanding an end to serfdom, fairer taxes, and justice from a monarchy that had long overlooked their suffering. Though the rebellion was ultimately suppressed, Its echoes rang through English politics for centuries. The power of the common man, once negligible, had begun to assert itself, a direct consequence of the upheaval sparked by the Black Death. Monarchs and rulers also adapted. To stabilize realms weakened by depopulation, they centralized authority, reducing the influence of fragmented feudal lords. Stronger, more unified governments emerged, laying the groundwork for the rise of modern nation-states such as France, Spain, and England. Standing armies, funded by growing royal treasuries, replaced feudal levies. New systems of taxation and administration appeared, allowing kings to govern more effectively across vast territories. The Church, long the ultimate power in medieval Europe, saw its influence wane. Its failure to protect the faithful from the plague, combined with the loss of countless clergy, shattered confidence in its spiritual supremacy. While still immensely powerful, the Church faced growing criticism and calls for reform. Figures like John Wycliffe in England and Jan Hus in Bohemia began challenging ecclesiastical corruption and advocating for greater access to Scripture and personal faith. These early reformers planted seeds that would eventually blossom into the Protestant Reformation. Imagine a modest chapel in Prague, where Hus delivers a sermon to a congregation weary of grand cathedrals and papal decrees. He speaks of humility, faith without pomp, and the moral failings of church leaders who had abandoned the dying during the plague years. Whispers of dissent ripple through Europe, marking the first cracks in the once unshakable wall of religious orthodoxy. At the same time, the consolidation of wealth among survivors created a new class of merchants, bankers, and entrepreneurs. Freed from rigid feudal ties, these individuals expanded trade networks across the Mediterranean and beyond. In Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa, powerful merchant families amassed fortunes, financing not only art and science, but also exploration. The desire to secure trade routes and access exotic goods pushed Europeans toward the seas, ushering in the age of discovery. Picture the bustling docks of Lisbon or Genoa in the late 15th century. Ships are loaded with spices, silks, and precious metals, while navigators chart courses to uncharted waters. The maritime innovations that would lead explorers like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus across oceans had roots in the mercantile transformations set in motion by the plague's redistribution of wealth and labor. The same forces that weakened old feudal bonds fueled ambitions to reach beyond Europe's shores. Technological advancements followed. Shipbuilding improved, navigational tools became more precise, and knowledge from the Islamic world and ancient texts found renewed application. The appetite for risk, born from a generation that had stared mortality in the face, drove explorers to seek fortunes and glory in lands unknown. Without the social upheaval caused by the Black Death, the great voyages of discovery that reshaped global history might have been delayed by centuries. Political philosophy, too, evolved. Thinkers began questioning the divine right of kings and the absolute authority of rulers. Concepts of governance rooted in reason, representation, and individual rights slowly emerged. While it would take centuries for these ideas to fully flourish, the collapse of unquestioned hierarchies during the plague years cracked open possibilities for future revolutions in thought and politics. By the dawn of the 16th century, Europe stood on the threshold of a new age. The medieval world, marked by castles, serfs, and unquestioned spiritual authority, had given way to centralized monarchies, vibrant trade economies, and a restless curiosity about the world beyond. This transformation was not a clean break. Vestiges of feudalism and old religious power remained strong, yet the trajectory of history had shifted irrevocably. Imagine standing atop a hill overlooking Florence in 1500. Below, the city's skyline bristles with domes and bell towers, symbols of newfound wealth and cultural achievement. Merchant caravans snake along roads that once lay silent during plague years, and ships sail toward horizons medieval rulers never dared to imagine. The suffering of the Black Death lingers in memory, but its aftermath has birthed a society poised to shape the modern world. As we near the end of this long journey through plague and transformation, one final chapter remains: to understand the enduring legacy of the Black Death, not just in Europe's politics, art, or economy, but in the very way humanity perceives itself, mortality, and resilience in the face of catastrophe. Though centuries have passed since the Black Death ravaged Europe, its shadow lingers still, not only in historical records, ruins, or faded artworks, but in the psyche of humanity itself. The survivors of the plague and generations that followed carried deep psychological scars. These scars shaped philosophy, moral thought, and even modern understandings of life, death, and human resilience. Imagine walking through a European town square, decades after the final waves of plague. The market bustles again, children play freely, and church bells ring for weddings rather than funerals. Yet behind the smiles of merchants and laughter of families, there is a shared, unspoken knowledge. Everyone here has lost someone. Every household bears its own stories of grief and survival, memories passed from parent to child like heirlooms too heavy to set down. This collective trauma profoundly changed the medieval worldview. Before the Black Death, life was firmly framed by religious certainty and rigid social order. Death was a known, distant endpoint, not a constant presence. But during the plague years, mortality became immediate and unpredictable. Entire families disappeared overnight. Wealth and privilege offered no protection. Death had stripped away illusions of control, forcing a confrontation with life's fragility that reverberated through philosophy and culture for generations. One response to this new reality was a heightened focus on the memento mori, a reminder of death. These phrases, artworks, and traditions urged people never to forget that life was fleeting. Skulls were carved into jewelry, hourglasses appeared in paintings, and sermons echoed with warnings that each day could be the last. While morbid to modern ears, these reminders were not meant to terrify, but to encourage a deeper appreciation of existence and spiritual readiness for its inevitable end. Picture a quiet monastery in the Alps, where a lone monk carves a wooden cross decorated with a skull and blooming flowers intertwined. The message is clear: life and death are inseparable, and beauty can only be fully cherished when one accepts its impermanence. This blending of darkness and light became a hallmark of post-plague thought, leading to a richer, more nuanced understanding of human experience. Philosophically, thinkers began questioning the medieval belief that human destiny was fully determined by divine will. If the plague struck down saints and sinners alike, perhaps chance, nature, or human actions played a greater role in life's outcomes than previously acknowledged. Scholars explored ideas of fate, free will, and individual responsibility with new urgency. These debates subtly shifted the intellectual climate, preparing Europe for the later rise of secular philosophy and modern science. The trauma also inspired a reevaluation of human dignity. Having witnessed the equalizing power of death, people saw less justification for rigid hierarchies that placed nobles and clergy above common folk. While true equality was centuries away, the first sparks of humanism glimmered in post-plague Europe. This intellectual movement celebrated human potential, creativity, and rational thought, principles that would flourish during the Renaissance and Enlightenment. Psychologically, survivors exhibited a range of responses that echo in human behavior during modern crises. Some became deeply pious, dedicating their lives to God as gratitude for survival. Others pursued earthly pleasures with newfound intensity, adopting the philosophy of eat, drink, and be merry while time allowed. Many fluctuated between these extremes, seeking balance in a world where tomorrow was never guaranteed. Communal bonds, though strained during the worst outbreaks, eventually deepened in recovery. Shared suffering fostered empathy and mutual aid. Guilds, confraternities, and early charitable organizations expanded, caring for widows, orphans, and the poor. Acts of compassion became not just moral duties, but essential elements of social survival. From these efforts grew traditions of civic responsibility and welfare that persist in various forms to this day. Even the language of medicine and public health owes much to the Black Death's psychological impact. Fear of recurrence spurred the development of better sanitation, quarantine protocols, and eventually the study of contagion itself. The invisible terror of plague forced humanity to think systematically about disease, laying early foundations for modern epidemiology and the idea that societies could collectively protect themselves from unseen threats. Imagine a physician in 15th century Milan reviewing old records of plague outbreaks. With trembling hands, he traces patterns of spread across towns, noting where quarantines worked and where they failed. Though he does not yet know about bacteria or fleas, his observations spark questions that will one day lead to germ theory and modern medicine. The psychological imprint of fear and loss becomes a catalyst for progress, pushing humanity to seek understanding rather than surrender to despair. Ultimately, the greatest philosophical legacy of the Black Death was a shift in how humans saw themselves in the universe. Medieval Europe had believed in a divinely ordered hierarchy, with humanity at its center, guided by providence. The plague shattered that illusion, revealing a natural world indifferent to human plans, capable of wiping away entire civilizations. In response, humans began seeking meaning not solely in divine mysteries, but in themselves, in their capacity for reason, art, invention, and resilience. By the time Europe fully entered the Renaissance, this transformation was clear. Cathedrals and universities no longer looked only to heaven for answers. They turned to human inquiry, ancient knowledge, and empirical observation. The Black Death had taught an enduring lesson that to face mortality honestly is not to surrender to despair, but to awaken to life's profound depth and possibility. As we move to our concluding chapter, we will step back and see how the echoes of the Black Death still shape our modern world in medicine, art, society, and our very understanding of what it means to live and die as human beings. Centuries have passed since the Black Death first swept through Europe, yet its shadow stretches across history, touching even our modern world. The pestilence that once decimated populations, shattered social orders, and reshaped human thought has become more than a historical event. It is a defining chapter in the human story, a testament to fragility, resilience, and transformation. Imagine standing today in a quiet European village where centuries-old churches still ring their bells. Tourists stroll along cobbled streets, unaware that beneath their feet lie the bones of plague victims buried in forgotten mass graves. Museums display relics of the era, wooden plague doctor masks, illuminated manuscripts chronicling outbreaks, and faded murals of the Dance of Death. These artifacts are not just remnants of a distant past, they are silent witnesses to a tragedy that forced humanity to evolve. Medicine, for one, owes much to the lessons of the Black Death. The desperate attempts to understand and contain the plague led to the birth of quarantine practices, early epidemiology, and the slow abandonment of superstition in favor of observation and reason. Today's public health systems, vaccination programs, and medical science trace a faint but undeniable lineage back to those harrowing days when Europe first confronted the reality of contagious disease. Economically and socially, the redistribution of wealth and labor shortages permanently altered Europe's trajectory. The collapse of feudalism, rise of a middle class, and eventual birth of capitalism can all be traced in part to the population upheaval of the plague years. Modern concepts of workers' rights, urban planning, and social mobility grew from seeds planted in the wake of devastation. Culturally, the Black Death reshaped art, literature, and philosophy. From the somber imagery of Memento Mori to the human-centered vision of the Renaissance, it sparked a reevaluation of existence that still resonates. Even in contemporary art and storytelling, echoes of the plague's lessons about mortality, survival, and the human spirit persist, reminding us that no civilization is immune to nature's forces. Philosophically, the plague dismantled absolute reliance on divine order and fostered a sense of human agency. It laid the groundwork for secularism, scientific inquiry, and the Enlightenment, shifting humanity's gaze from the heavens to the world around and within itself. The modern belief in progress, reason, and human potential owes something to the crucible of suffering endured during the plague era. In times of modern pandemics, from cholera to the recent global crisis of COVID-19, society has instinctively drawn on practices and insights first forged during the Black Death: quarantines, social distancing, public health measures, and the balance between fear and compassion. These responses, centuries apart, show that the memory of that ancient pestilence still guides our instincts for survival. But beyond systems and ideas, the deepest legacy is human resilience. The Black Death revealed humanity's capacity to endure unimaginable loss, adapt to radical change, and rebuild from ruins into something new. From a world defined by death emerged one that rediscovered life more fully, through art, exploration, science, and a richer understanding of what it means to be human. Picture the dawn breaking over Florence today, its skyline adorned with domes and spires, born from post-plague ambition. Streets once emptied by fear now echo with footsteps of millions, each one a distant descendant of survivors who refused to succumb to despair. The same sun that rose over plague carts and abandoned fields centuries ago now shines on bustling cities, humming hospitals and universities filled with minds still grappling with questions of mortality and meaning. The Black Death did not end humanity, it reshaped it. From the darkest chapter came a new beginning, one that set the stage for modern civilization itself. Its story reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, human beings have an extraordinary ability not only to survive, but to transform suffering into progress, loss into wisdom, and endings into new dawns. And so, as we close this journey through the shadowed past, the bells of history still toll softly in the distance, not in mourning alone, but as a call to remember, to learn, and to honor the countless lives that through tragedy and endurance changed the course of humanity forever.